Atheist Alliance International podcast.
I don't make this stuff up.
You know, if you put Jesus Christ first, that he'll look after all your bills.
It's not fake, it's faith.
Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Atheist Alliance International podcast. I'm your host, Jason Sylvester. Joining me today is the Vice President of the Hungarian Atheist Society, and I'm going to try and get his name right, Gáspár Békés. And
that is right, that is correct.
Yeah. So Gáspár, he's here to talk to us today about what's going on in Hungary with the Orbán regime and his own struggles with being forthright and outspoken and what that has meant to him. So Gáspár, thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you very much, Jason, for having me. It's definitely a pleasure to expand the horizons beyond Hungary and the immediate region. And I'm very glad that we can learn from each other's experiences. All these international talks I had recently point to the fact that there are quite a few similarities when it comes to authoritarian regimes weaponizing religion. And I think it's an important thing to say that this doesn't have anything to do with faith per se, because often the criticism is that, we're just criticizing faith, or we're like hating Christians or hating God, whichever God. And I think that's one of the counter arguments they say. And without being too reactive, I think it's still important to say that there are, I think, commonalities with believers and with non-believers, and that a secular basis can be a good foundation to rally behind. And we'll get to that later, as I think we will talk about potential solutions and potential reactions to the processes we're experiencing. But before getting ahead of myself, to kind of give you the lay of the land in Hungary, the Orbán regime has been in power since 2010, so that's quite a long time. It's 13 years. And nowadays, I like to avoid the use of government as a description for the Orbán regime, because there has to be a very clear distinction between the democratically elected government and a regime. And although the Orbán government, so to say, was elected democratically, it wasn't a clean election, because the way they do is they gerrymander the voting borders, they change the voting system, they spend infinite amounts of money for propaganda and poster campaigns from central funds and other allocated funds as a party. So they have government handouts before elections. The state media is only pushing governmental propaganda. So we can kind of see how they skew the elections and how they destroy the education system in the meantime. And now that had 13 years of progress. So although they're not cheating with the numbers of in the elections, they rig the system in a way that it's only quasi-democratic. And one more addition to this, perhaps the most telling, is there has been a state of emergency in Hungary for the last 6 years. So there's a rule by decree in Hungary. Most things are just accepted by rule by decree. So although the parliament is not suspended, but the government, the regime can basically push through anything they like, anything they want, and they do it often. So I would not call a state a democracy when you have a state of emergency for years. What is the definition of how many months or years has to pass? I'm not sure, but I'm exactly sure that 6 years is more than what is democratic. So that is the lay of the land for now. But there are still actors in play in Hungary that oppose the regime, and I would say there are fundamental freedoms that have not been trampled yet. So the state of the regime at the moment is that they don't jail people or they don't physically harm people yet for their expressions, and it's very rare that they get any kind of proceeding against them for their freedom of expression. But it's not without example. How these regimes usually work is they are always testing their limits and they're gradually pushing forward. And the speed is somewhat differing from country to country, but nonetheless, it's always pushing forward. And it's important to understand that these regimes are never satisfied. So it's not like the Orbán regime has won its fourth victory in the elections with 2/3 majority. So they wouldn't even need the rule by decree. They just like the amount of power that it comes with it and the ease that they can push through. And they're always pushing new and new regulations, legislation to restrict fundamental freedoms. And at this point, the only logical explanation is that this is a self-generating psychological cycle of power and hoarding power and hoarding wealth, because there's nothing really for them to gain or conquer. They have everything they want, but nevertheless they still oppress fundamental freedoms. And I think the Putin regime is similar. Like, the largest country in the world wants to expand its territory. They have total control of everything, yet that Putin still thinks that he needs more in terms of territory or power. And people are dying by the tens of thousands. They're genociding part of their own population as well, not just the Ukrainians. And yet they're pushed forward because probably Putin has this idea as an old man that he will reinvigorate the Soviet Empire. And he's a former KGB agent, and he wants this to be his legacy. It makes no sense. If you look at international relations theory, which is in my wheelhouse as an expert, we always assume that they're rational actors. And more often than not, that's not the case. And with absolute power, there's absolute corruption. So when we come to Putin or Orban or Erdogan, you don't have to look at it from a logical perspective. When we come from a logic of statehood, it's not about that they need more power for anything. It's just they want it. And it's self-generating. So if you look at it from that perspective, I think we can understand it a lot easier of how this works. But anyhow, back to the regime itself. When it comes to freedoms, we see a clear trend that the way they are transforming the system in Hungary is that they're using religion as an excuse or a channel to string different illiberal steps. So basically, Orban himself proclaimed that Hungary is an illiberal Christian democracy. Well, it's a lot to wrap your head around, isn't it? And of course, these words just don't mix well together, because a democracy has to be liberal by definition. At least I think we could have a debate, I guess, on that. But I mean, to me, it's fairly straightforward. And also, a democracy cannot be Christian or even atheist or whichever, because the separation of church and state, and of course, the equal treatment enshrined in the Constitution and laws and international treaties would stipulate that we don't have a state religion or straight irreligion in a way that, for example, some communist state had in the past. So that would mean that the state couldn't be labeled as Christian. And the problem is that the separation of powers in Hungary has diminished so far that there's no real legal or other challenge to this definition. And that's in a way understandable that different branches of government don't necessarily oppose this, just as they don't oppose other areas of restrictions or corruption or whatever, like the police that investigate corruption cases. But religion is special in a way that political stakeholders outside of party politics or authorities, they are also not talking about this issue at all. So they're not vehemently or constructively opposing the regime's step towards a theocracy, whereas they're opposing other steps like corruption or poverty. So the other topics they're very active in, but with religion there is an exception. So, and this is very interesting, because if you look at the level of religiousness of different countries in the region or in Europe, Hungary is one of the least religious countries. And there are a number of studies I could cite, but more than 75% of people don't find religion to be very important in their daily lives. Only 4% of young people go to church weekly. So it's a real diminishing base, and it never was religious to begin with very much. So
it sounds a bit of a contradiction with Orban's claim that it's a Christian democracy, an illiberal Christian democracy, if the majority of the population doesn't even care.
Exactly, and that's the interesting question for me. Why does this not just does it work? That's a different question. I mean, we'll get to that. Does it actually work? But it works on the opposition, and it works on political thinkers, that they kind of accept this as a fact, and they don't look at the statistics that it's not true. They just believe that in order to keep the voters or to convince the unaligned voters, they have to align themselves with this idea of a Christian Hungary. So they're quoting from the Bible, they're quoting from Pope Francis, when they're always welcoming when the Pope comes to Hungary, although like we could talk about how the Pope is a populist politician just as anybody else. And when you look at his legislation or his other quotes, which they don't quote, when he's saying like people are not human when they don't have 2 children, he says that you're not worthy of being a human, or that beating your children is beautiful if it's done with certain limitations. So we could say that, but no. But the point is that they are completely tone deaf to their own public and audience when it comes to religion, and it seems the government managed to fool the opposition in this regard, whereas they're critical in other regards. But when it's about religion, they completely lose their sense of criticism. And why is that? Is it because they have this false notion that this is true, that everybody is a Christian, you have to please them? Is it because they themselves personally are Christians, or important figures are Christians themselves, and they inadvertently align themselves with this, or it's part of a bigger idea that they have to be? Or is it just fear? So there are a number of theories I have on why is this. But I think one of the missions of the Hungarian Atheist Society is to convince political stakeholders to see the reality that this is not true, and people actually have very strong opinions against the church and the churches, and how they are siphoning public funds, how they're exempt from a number of laws in Hungary. And there's a very strong opposition to this when you look at comment sections, or when we look at our membership, or so there's very clear signs to that. And of course part of it is anecdotal evidence, because there's no surveys. So one of the things we're actually collecting money for in the future is to have an in-depth survey, both as a representative survey and both as a focus group survey, to gauge people's attitudes towards the collaboration between church and government. And we would ask, of course, not just atheists, but of course religious people, because we think that in Hungary, even most believers are not okay with what's happening in terms of colluding between the church and state. So we're definitely looking into that, because we want to raise the attention and want to be more visible when it comes to this, because as said, this is one of the ways the Orban regime is pushing forward its agenda. It's always looking at the gaps. The Orban regime is always looking at the gaps, like where can they advance their propaganda and illiberal agenda. And this is one of the places where they face no opposition. So this is one of the worst places where they actually push forward. And this is where, for example, prosecution happens. One case would be that there was a Hungarian person who was molested by a priest in Hungary when he was a child. And even though he launched a number of complaints with the clergy, he got no response. And then basically he started calling bishops, archbishops in Hungary, and he finally wanted to go to a mass celebrated by the Archbishop of Hungary, Péter Erdő. And for some reason, Péter Erdő knew about this, so he called the police, and somehow he has a personal contact in the police, and this guy was arrested and handcuffed and placed in a jail cell just for attempting to go to this mass. Like he was never ever even charged with a crime before, or then later he was actually, and he was handcuffed, which I have to say, like, unlike the US, you cannot handcuff people almost in any situation in Hungary. So only if somebody is suspected of committing a violent crime or resisting arrest is the only reason why you can be handcuffed. And there were a number of lawsuits related to this. So police usually don't do that. But this guy was handcuffed just for attempting to go to a mass and perhaps maybe asking about his own case. And then he was charged with harassment, and he was sentenced for harassment in court. And it's important to mention that in Hungary, priests are public officials of the state. So they have been made the same status as a teacher, or mailman, or a police officer. And they are paid by the state. They're even paid by the state. Their salaries are paid by the state even abroad. So in the region of the Carpathian Basin where Hungarian minorities live, in Romania, Slovakia, etc., they're paid by the state as well. So that's how close they are. So asking a public official about their duties is a crime in this case. And with any other institution, this wouldn't really happen. And this was a scandal in Hungary, but it shows how far the regime is going when it comes to religion. And my own example would be another one, that I wrote articles about the problem, the lack of secularism, and how, for example, children shouldn't be baptized because it violates their constitutional freedom. Like, you wouldn't make your infant join the party or any party, because that would be weird, right? But why would you make them join a religion, especially if we look at how no children are baptized in the Bible, and actually it has to be a free choice, and that it means that you can only be baptized as an adult. And this is, of course, practiced and preached by Baptists and Anabaptists, so it's not a new argument either. And 3 years after writing these articles, I was fired from my job, which is completely unrelated. I was an environmental scientist, an environmental professional, and I was fired for this from Budapest City Hall, which is controlled by the so-called liberal opposition to Orban. And I was fired after a smear campaign launched by the vice prime minister, who is the head of the Christian Democratic Party, joined to the Orban's Fidesz party. And I was fired in 2 days without any question. And I was denounced by my own city hall. And my bosses were opposing it. I had great performance reviews. Didn't matter. I was fired for this because they manufactured a fake hysteria. And this is the state of Hungary. And I wouldn't not have been fired if I was a Baptist and I was preaching the same thing as a Baptist. Or if it was any other topic, I would not have been fired. But with this, there's an exemption. And it wasn't due to public pressure because nobody really complained about it. It was manufactured. And I think it comes to the point, like, what is the limit of free speech? And we often see that when it comes to free speech, people are citing being offended. But how do you quantify offense, right? How do you measure offense? And why would it matter? Is there like a limit? Like, should we set a law that if 10 people are offended or 100 people are offended, and they can like maybe like select in a survey like 1 to 10, and then somebody gets fired or jailed? Or so it's ridiculous. We cannot restrict free speech based on that. I think the only limit to free speech should be the incitement of violence, because we have seen that inciting violence does lead to violence more often than not. So I feel like that should be a hard limit. But anything else, I think, falls under free speech. And of course, mine wasn't even hateful or inciting not violence or anything else. It was just an argument and expressed in a very clear way. So I would say that this is a debate for the ages. Of course, it could tie into other debates of the sexual minorities or sexual orientation. I think it's ongoing debate in the US as well. But nonetheless, I would feel like the government is using the offense of religious minorities in a way to curtail free speech, and this is why people usually don't. Yeah,
that happens everywhere. So.
Yeah, I mean, and here in the US, there was a professor who showed a picture of Prophet Muhammad. He was an art history professor, and he showed a picture of Muhammad from, I think, the 16th century, and he was fired from the university. Although, like, it was completely relevant to the course, and it was obviously not even a criticism, and yet he was fired. I don't know the current state, but like he was.
Yeah, I read that article. So, yeah, and I think from what I remember, that article, he gave like a trigger warning to the class to say this is, we're going to be discussing, art and stuff. Yeah, there was a big pushback on that. So regarding your case, so maybe our viewers might be interested. So you got fired. So maybe, is that still pending? Presumably you challenged, that your dismissal on the ground. So are you fighting that in court? Like how's that going? Has it been resolved?
Yeah, I feel like it wouldn't be me if I wasn't fighting it in court. I mean, I was an activist for a long time, for 6 or 7 years now, and I always dealt with children's rights. And when children's rights meet religious privileges, that's usually a bad combination. And this was just one of the many articles I wrote. I wrote an article about circumcision, for example, which is also very interesting and quite controversial, I would say. But I wrote about violence in school systems. I wrote about children's right to democratic education, smartwatches. So it wasn't like a highlighted article. It was just one of my many articles. And yes, indeed, I challenged the decision in court. So I sued City Hall for discriminative termination. So I think the correct terminology is unlawful termination, I guess. I won in court in 2021 first, and it was appealed, and then I achieved a 3/4 victory in the secondary court. So basically, it's already in force partially, saying that the written warning I received 1 day before my firing as like a kind of an excuse of process was completely legal. It was not founded in any kind of law. It was unlawful, and that served as the basis of my termination. And but one part was sent back to the first court, And that part was that there's a law in Hungary saying that even as a public official, even outside of your work, you cannot act or express yourself in a manner that would how to say, I'm trying to translate in my head, that would shed a negative light to City Hall or your workplace. So it is quite a vague law, and the first court didn't really explore this. And the reason why they didn't really explore this was that the claim of City Hall was so absurd already that they didn't find it warranted. Because what City Hall was playing, that they publicly denounced me. So there were the articles that were published about me. So basically, there was this Christian Democratic portal. So there's the Christian Democratic Party aligned with the Orban regime. They have an actual newspaper, and there a number of neo-Nazis work. And I'm not exaggerating. They are a member of neo-Nazi organizations. And one of these neo-Nazis wrote the article about me, that I'm a blasphemer, I hate Christians, whatever. And basically, this was pushed through the government media because they own hundreds of newspapers and TVs. So they just like literally verbatim repeated what he wrote. And afterwards, the City Hall denounced me and then fired me the next day. And they actually contacted the media before they contacted me. So everybody knew everything about me and regarding me before I actually learned about it. So completely unprofessional. But the point here is that this was the focus of the inquiry. So only the articles that were written 3 years prior, I began employment. But in court, City Hall argues that I wasn't fired for the articles. They argue that I was fired for Facebook posts on my personal Facebook page, profile, not even page, that were offensive to people. And I didn't make it clear that my personal Facebook profile was personal and I wasn't acting in an official capacity. So it's obvious why they invented this, because you couldn't get fired for something done before your employment. They would lose the case immediately. So now they're making it worse for everyone else, because if they would win in court, that would mean that from now on, everybody could get fired for posting on Facebook anything, not even being offensive. But if you don't have a disclaimer under all your Facebook posts that this is I'm in Mallorca and I am not having a vacation on governmental money, this is not a post officially from my workplace, you could get fired. It could be a grounds for termination. And they're fighting for this. So in order just not to lose this case in general, they're trying to restrict workers' freedoms to an extent not even the Orban regime goes to, which is shocking. It's absolutely shocking. And for now, I'm not just fighting for myself and the freedom of press, freedom of expression, freedom of belief or religion, but I'm fighting for workers' rights, because if they succeed, you could get fired for anything, and people will get fired for anything if they succeed. It will be used as a precedent and a ground. So why the court didn't mention my views and why it could shed a bad light to governance, because the City Hall couldn't even prove that the whole case was about Facebook posts that I made during my time at City Hall. Because as said, the journal articles, everything was only about my articles 3 years prior. Nobody mentioned my Facebook posts. So it wasn't a part of the whole ordeal. So now they're claiming that they fired me for something that was not scandalous at all. Nobody mentioned it, but they found it offensive. So obviously it's so bogus that the court refused to elaborate on that. But it was technically they should have, yes. So that's why it got pushed back to the first court. And then I won again, because they re-examined it and they made a very clear analysis of my Facebook post. They were saying that not only it was not offensive what I wrote on Facebook about a number of subjects, but as a progressive liberal, which was designated by court and my testimony that I'm a progressive liberal, I wrote posts about pacifism, I wrote posts about human rights, and I wrote posts about the support of children's rights above anything, above all else. And court had to examine whether these activities and forms of expression could undermine the reputation of City Hall, which is a giant slap to the face of City Hall, because if anything, they should commend my activities outside of work and not fire me for them. And now they appealed again, which is surprising, as I don't think they have any chance of winning. And it's important to note that the longer this trial takes, the more money City Hall is losing. And not just by the procedure, but the court has said that I have to be reinstated in my office and in my official capacity, and all my unpaid salary has to be paid, and I am to be designated as a worker who has never been fired. So I'm Schrödinger's employee at the moment. I might be employed by City Hall pending a ruling, or I might have been actually fired more than 2 years ago. I guess we'll wait and see.
Yeah. So it sounds like they're afraid of something if they're trying to claim what they're claiming. That that you need disclaimers, which is ridiculous because people know your personal posts are nothing to do with your job, so it's ridiculous. So did the Christian Democratic Party comment after you got your first overturn?
Oh no, nothing. They only commented when I was fired. They thanked City Hall for firing me, and I really believe if the government or the regime thanks you for anything in the opposition, you should just resign. I mean, because the difference is so huge. And there was no comment. There was actually a UN inquiry into my case fairly recently. I learned about it, that the UN Special Rapporteur for freedom of expression, the Special Rapporteur for minorities, and the Special Rapporteur for freedom of belief and conscience issued a joint inquiry into my case at the request of Humanist International. And they detailed my experience and how, besides being fired, I received a number of death threats, which I submitted police complaints, and the police rejected it, and I appealed them with the prosecutor's office, and that also got rejected. Well, I guess I was at the mercy of whoever was threatening me, whether they would follow through or not, because certainly not the police nor City Hall, my former employer, did anything in their power to protect me from prosecution. So that would mean that they detailed this inquiry, and then in the end, basically they had this inquiry, and they asked asked the government to comment on this and to see like what kind of inquiry they made and whatnot. And without any kind of merit, they just said that, hey, we investigated, nothing is to be seen. The courts have decided something, and Christians are more prosecuted anyways. So it was just like a textbook reply, unfortunately. I'm not sure if there are any further steps that UN could take, but this is the case right now. So I'm still in court battle after 2.5 years. I'm not happy with it, and I had a hard time getting employed in Hungary afterwards. So I would have found other employment, but I explicitly got told that for political reasons they will not hire me. And it's been very hard for me, even though I have 4 degrees. I have 3 master degrees from world-leading universities. As a young professional, I'm fairly qualified, as much as I can tell and relate. But I can't get a job in Hungary in my own profession, which is devastating. And besides the emotional and psychological effect, it's hard in terms of finances and livelihood. And I'm 29 years old, and how do you progress and build your life when they ruined your career? And the only choice I had was to go abroad. And I'm currently a trainee abroad, and I'm not really disclosing where, because for obvious reasons. I mean, it's not unpublic, but I don't like to talk about it in public, and also, I mean, to avoid confusing my professional capacity with my personal capacity, I won't mention it. But that's only temporary, and afterwards, I don't know. And I'm really looking forward to go to a place where I can have my freedom of expression and also fulfill my professional hopes and dreams. But also, I will always be a supporter of Hungarian democracy and rule of law and human rights, especially secular rights. So that's my case in a nutshell. But it kind of shows how, if you express yourself on religion and secularism, there are consequences. And there have been other cases as well. There was a Hungarian journalist who had a hate campaign against him because he asked the question that why did the chief surgeon of Hungary or chief doctor of Hungary, medical officer in Hungary, wear a cross in a public statement that he thinks that is unprofessional. And he got this huge smear campaign, and he got death threats as well and whatnot. He wasn't fired, but he got death threats as well. So just for asking a very simple question, like in France, for example, it would be, in France, you cannot wear those symbols when you're a public official. So it's not like something that's out of, it's just so horrible. This other person was at a protest, and he was protesting in a way that he was handing out mock abortion tablets dressed as a priest to protest the Catholic Church, and he was sentenced. He was sentenced to apologize because he offended religious sensibilities, and he was sentenced to a fine or probation or whatnot. So that happens, and these cases are. And there was also a caricaturist who was also sentenced because he made a caricature of Jesus. So this does happen in Hungary, and the backlash is varied. So some people say it's not okay from the political side, but I wouldn't say there's a united front for secularism or freedom of speech when it comes to religion. And this is the point I want to emphasize, that the opposition political parties could criticize the regime's attitude towards religion. And I would say it would be even beneficial. Like, you could build momentum, you could build a political momentum on that, because people are very fed up. As much as I can tell without a concrete survey, our experience is that people are very fed up how, while people are starving, are having huge financial troubles due to the increased inflation, the church is getting more and more and more money, or the churches, to be honest. Hungary has the highest church support from state per capita in the European Union. There are a number of laws that the churches are exempt from. So, for example, they're exempt from the equal treatment law, which is of course not unique. So that's why the Catholic Church can not employ women. They are allowed to not employ women. They're allowed to racially segregate in their schools. They're allowed to religiously segregate in their schools, or just not take students who they don't like. As I said, they're publicly designated officials. They're tax-free, they're tax exempt, and they are exempt from a number of tax evaluations or authorities as well. And we have a number of other laws they're exempt from. And this is just the surface. So this is the jure, and there's the de facto part. So I think one case I would like to highlight, there was a man in Hungary who molested his own child, and he got sentenced to jail. So he was in jail for 8 years. And he was well, not a preacher, but like a religious teacher, a religion teacher. And the church appointed him, after he completed his sentence, into a school with 6-year-olds. And he molested children again, and he went back to prison. But the church, as any other institution, has an obligation to check for the ethics certificate of anybody who they employ in schools. So it would have been clear that he's a convicted sex offender, but they didn't check it. And very publicly, they said, we didn't check it, so what? And nobody got prosecuted, not in a internal clergy investigation, neither an official investigation. Obviously, what should have happened, that these people would have gone to jail, because at very least, it's a mispractice of a governmental, like an official capacity, but it can also be, I'm not even sure that was an accident, because as we know how the church operates worldwide, they don't really care who was abused, and they're just right to cover it up more than anything. So, but their license wasn't revoked to appoint teachers or anything. And this was a public case, and there are so many cases we never learn about. So this is what happens when there's a public case, and it just goes on, and nobody cares, and nothing happens, because they have absolute power. They can do anything they want. And for example, there's this new law in Hungary that is against sex offenders and pedophiles, and it has been kind of mashed together with like an anti-LGBTQ law. And the opposition, for once, said that so there's a sex offender database that the government established, and it says, like, if you're in that database, you cannot be a school teacher, for example, and it designates a number of professions that you cannot fulfill if you're a sex offender. And priests wasn't one of them, or religious teacher wasn't one of them. So the opposition submitted an appeal, like an amendment to this law, that if you cannot be a priest if you're a sex offender, and the government rejected it. And they're saying, like, the whole campaign now is to protect children from LGBTQ propaganda or the EU or whatever it is. They had posters about it. So the whole point here would be that this was an act from the opposition, a good initiative, and then they just left it. Like, they should have posted this all around Hungary. The government allows pedophiles to be priests, and that should have been the slogan. They should have pushed it throughout, and it's not a lie. It's the truth. So it's not, I mean, obviously I don't support any kind of propaganda or any kind of misleading of people, but in this case, this would be 100% correct. So they could build a momentum criticizing the church, the number of funds they're receiving, or the sex scandals they're having, and they're not doing it. And I wonder why.
So if the population, as you said, is very irreligious, the high statistical number of people who aren't religious, then how is the church still have so much power? You would think if the population is becoming more and more secular, that the church should be correspondingly losing any power it had, as their base is evaporating, or is it just the government is using it as rhetoric in their tools to oppress?
They're good at faking it. So the media, as I said, the regime owns a lot of the media. So they can, for example, in Hungary, there are, I think, 5 Christian radio channels on air in Budapest. Like, I don't think anybody listens to them really, but they're like 5. Like, we have like maybe like 12 radio channels, and like 5 are like Mary Radio, Catholic Radio, Holy Crown Radio, Mana Radio, and like, I just listened to it. It was like one of the religious holidays recently, and they were just like Bible quote. I was switching channels in my car, and it was just like one quote from the Bible, another quote from the Bible. It's like everybody wants this, so they're creating this illusion that well, if there's so much content being produced and put out there, and celebrations and whatnot, I mean, somebody must listen to it, and it's not really true. So one of the things that was recently happening is the Pope coming to Hungary, and he came for a second time in a short amount of time, in a matter of, I think, 1 or 2 years. And I think that was the complete capitulation of the Hungarian opposition to religious propaganda, because the government paid for the Pope coming here, and it cost 11 billion forints. And I can't convert it in my head, but it was millions of dollars, or tens of millions of dollars. How was it? Yeah, it was more than 200 million forints. It was about $10 million or $20-30 million for paying for the whole procession, like the whole coming here, the festival. They had like events everywhere, and obviously the Pope came and he said like some speech about peace and love and whatnot, and obviously he didn't address how this whole thing was paid by taxpayers, how the huge scandals of sexual offense was on the table in Hungary at the time, because there's a Hungarian theologian, Rita Perintfalvi, and she wrote a bestseller book actually, about the church abuse in Hungary, and she started the process of gathering victims and victims' testimonies, and she has more than like 24 victims at the time. So this was very much in the public eye. And of course, the Pope never addressed it, and never addressed corruption or the restriction of religious freedoms. So the Pope came a second time, very recently in the last few months, and the same thing happened. The government paid for it, and even the opposition parties were like, "Oh yes, Pope Francis is coming. He is like this great secular leader. He's such a humanist, like human rights, environmentalism, whatever." And it's very interesting because first of all, they only quoted quotes from the Pope which are considered progressive. So when he's saying nice things about homosexuals, when he's saying nice things about being poor and like being modest, and of course there's nothing modest about the church, is there? Like they're actually, the government embezzled funds to fund his campaign to come here, and then he's saying like everybody should be humble. I mean, it's easy to say, but he does have other quotes, and they don't quote him on that. Like he literally said that if you beat your child with restraint, it's beautiful, and that around the topic of gender, the devil is sneaking around, and that if you don't have at least 2 children, you lose your humanity, and a bunch of other quotes I could quote. I mean, I didn't learn them all by heart, but he does say these things, and they don't quote him on it. So even the opposition censors itself to portray the Pope as like this progressive leader. And if you look at the actual policies of the Pope, nothing really changed. So the improvement is the rhetoric. And for example, women are still barred from being priests, and the Pope very concretely said women will never be priests. Also, celibacy will remain intact as well. Contraception is completely illegal. Homosexuality is still a sin if people have sexual relations. So if people are in a homosexual relations, they still go to hell. He only said that, if you're like in a platonic homosexual relation, it's fine. But that's not progress. It's not even progress by the definition of church. But also, like, we shouldn't compare the church to itself. Like, what kind of inertia system is that we compare it to itself? Like, we should compare it to universal human rights, and not newfound universal human rights, but things we had since the 50s. And they're just behind by 100 years or more. And if the Pope's vision would come to fruition, we wouldn't have contraception. We wouldn't have voting rights for women. I mean, the Holy See is the only country in the world that women cannot vote. Like, even Saudi Arabia has
they want a medieval system like they had before, so they don't like. So I can go into that later. I've got a series. I've started doing my own content, and one of my series is on the Pope's reactions to the modernism and liberalism in the 1800s. So when you've got all these, like, France and the United States had become secular republics, and all of, more and more people were demanding, freedom of speech and the press and education in Europe, and all these popes' reactions to it, which is quite hilarious. So, but you mentioned,
exactly.
you mentioned the Pope talking about homosexuality is a sin, and yet how ironic is that when he's surrounded by all of these homosexuals? Like, there's a book by a journalist came out about 2018, I think. It's called In the Closet of the Vatican, and he estimates that something like 80% of the senior clergy, so bishops, archbishops, cardinals, are homosexuals. And so, it's
completely
kind of
true. And and they're preaching about sexuality where they're not supposed to have sex at all, or teaching about how to raise children when they never had children. It's just such a hypocrisy. And it seems like people just lose their critical thinking skills when it comes to the church. When Orban says something, like, will just, like, help everyone, everybody's like, but if you look at his policies, it's obviously that's a lie. And then but if the Pope says something like, be humble and, like, share your, your wealth or whatever, and it's like, oh, he's such a Holy Spirit, like, he's so right. I mean, like, he's so progressive, and, like, they don't think about it at all. And I think that's the big danger of how religion just warps people's minds, and not even just Catholics' minds, but like secular, even atheists are claiming in Hungary, like, the Pope is such a progressive person. And the Atheist Society in Hungary has a very minority opinion on the Pope's perception, because we tried publishing articles in Hungarian progressive media about the Pope, and they don't get published. And then the progressive media claims that nobody criticized the visit of the Pope. It's so fortunate that finally we can agree on something as a nation, that the Pope's visit was nice, because nobody criticized him. And that newspaper was rejected, an article by one of our associates that criticized the Pope. So it's very clear that they knew it was a lie. And I think why do they do this is, I think there is this notion that if you support the Pope and the Pope is more progressive than Orban's version of Christianity, then this is a way forward to undermine the regime's idea and control of people in terms of religion. But that's completely unfounded, because the church is actually more extreme than the Orban regime in a number of senses. Like, the Orban regime doesn't ban contraception, they don't ban abortion. And the Pope would, like, the Vatican would. And if you see at Poland, for example, the church has a direct effect on how abortion was banned. In Hungary, for example, vasectomy was banned. So in Hungary, if you're under the age of 40 and you don't have 3 children, you cannot have a vasectomy anymore, because they banned it in 2014. Now, you cannot have a sterilization process as a woman either, but vasectomies are at least reversible. So, but still, it's completely banned. And there's a vasectomy tourism to Slovakia, which is very interesting. But the point here is that they are restricting reproductive rights wherever they can. And of course, that's an interesting issue. Like, they banned vasectomies because they knew that the men's rights movement in Hungary was a lot weaker. So they knew the backlash would be smaller. And that's why they got it through. Like, they would ban abortions. Obviously, there's a lot stronger sense of women's rights movements in Hungary, understandably, of course, and I'm very much support it. But they couldn't do that. But they can restrict men's rights because there's less of an established opposition. And the same goes with atheism or secularism. They always push forward where they face less opposition. And this is why, for example, I could be fired because City Hall thought it would be a politically beneficial move, that they will not lose voters on the Christian side, which is beneficial, but no, they won't lose voters on the atheist or secularist side because nobody will care, because there is no lobby, there is no agency, there's nothing. Because politicians are, obviously, they're not moral creatures. It's all about perception and about political gain, which is nothing new. But I mean, it's very miscalculated and it's very dangerous. So as I said, the Pope visit was in that sense a very bad step towards a more theocratic governance of Hungary, because nobody was really critical from the political side, and they believe that the only way forward is to cherish this progressive Pope and Popehood, whereas they should have criticized the entire Catholic Church and its operations in Hungary. I mean, if the Holy See was Holy See is a country, so they have agency in Hungary. It's like the Russian embassy in Hungary would spew Russian propaganda in Hungary and nothing would happen. I mean, wars have been started for less than this. And even though with the Catholic Church, they can have whatever influence they want and there is no backlash to it. And that's a problem. And it's very interesting in the US, when the Pope wanted direct control of the clergy, when the Pope was visiting, I think the US, I am not sure when, decades ago, the local clergy of the Catholic Church was protesting it because they said that they don't want to be dependent on the Holy See as like a side company or as to the parent company. So, but in Hungary, it's not like that. They're playing the double game. So the Hungarian clergy is completely aligned with the Orbán regime, but they're completely fine with the Pope as well. And nobody is criticizing that when the Pope comes here, he legitimizes the rule of Orbán because he doesn't criticize it. He says nice things, but he doesn't say anything. And when he comes here, the opposition leaders, they're quoting him on progressive ideas, and they're trying to spin it in a way that it's actually a criticism of the Orbán regime. But the Orbán regime does the same thing, and of course post the pictures of Orbán meeting the Pope and whatnot. And so both sides are trying to use it to their own gain, and everybody else is at a loss.
Yeah, it is a game, as you say. So, okay, well, we need to wrap it up. So, any final thoughts, or you've covered everything you wanted to talk about?
Well, it's you can never really cover everything, and I hope I was trying to stay on point, but there's a lot to unpack here. I guess in terms of solutions, what could and should be done is to have a more secular front, and for that we need more information, and we don't have a lot of information. So what would be needed on a national or regional perspective is to gauge what people think about religion and its connection to rule of law, to state. Like, do you want churches to be paid by taxpayers? Do you think churches should be exempt from the Equal Treatment Directive? Or do you think that children should be forced into religious institution by the state or their parents? And I think the answers will surprise many, that most people, even religious people, don't think like that. One thing I would still like to add is that the government often says that Europe is Christian and Hungary is a Christian nation, and even if there was a majority of Christians, it wouldn't be a Christian nation, right? Because it's so just because there's a majority of a certain denomination doesn't mean that they have special privileges. It shouldn't mean that they have special privileges, but it's not even the case in Hungary. But here, the point is that people would be surprised of what people actually think. Other people think about religion and rule of law, but there's no agency to tell them. They never meet this information. They think they're alone with their opinions. They think their opinions are they have to be hush-hush with their opinions, because anybody who expresses them suffers the fate I suffered and others suffered, because they have to make an example out of us before we get into the mainstream in that sense. But if we look at Europe itself, it's claimed that Hungary is a Christian nation and Europe is Christian and whatnot, and all the human rights we have are actually marvels of the church. And as you said, the church has opposed progress for centuries violently, whether it's contraception or voting rights or women's rights, and they still do. Like, how can Europe be built on the church when the church opposes the rules we have right now in terms of fundamental freedoms? It doesn't make any sense. But it also means that people living today, religious or not, believers or not, they share common values, and those common values have progressed far beyond the church's understanding. And we should unite behind that and make believers stand firm against illiberal agendas of church or state, and to have atheists do the same. And that could be the common ground, and to form an alliance and to say, hey, we're not alone. We actually the same thing. We want the same thing. And we acknowledge that the regime is using religion to usher in an even worse form of oppression. And then we can stand against that. And I think that's a lesson to be learned in many authoritarian regimes, whether it's Turkey, whether it's Hungary, whether it's Russia.
Okay. Well, thank you for joining us. So, thank you, Gáspár. It's great for you to join us and tell us what's going on in Hungary and your own personal story. So, thanks for your time. And I'd like to remind all of our viewers to please like and subscribe. And we'll see everybody in the next one. So, thanks again, Gáspár.
Thank you, Marge, very much, Jason. And see you next time.
All right. Take care, everybody. And we'll see everyone in the next episode. Take care. Bye-bye.
Okay, thanks for listening, and don't forget we're on YouTube, so follow us on YouTube. Just search for Atheist Alliance International, and please subscribe and hit that notification bell. We're also on all of your favourite podcast platforms, so make sure that you follow us on there as well. See you next time.